Thanks for clicking on my video. Before we get started, please click the subscribe button so that you can get more great content such as this one. Thanks. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm your host Sonny Coleman, and today I'm going to kind of go over some of the complications of using mind affecting spells, supernatural effects, spell-like abilities, stuff like that in most role-playing games. Usually it would be best for the DM or GM to have this discussion with their group, preferably before a campaign starts, or maybe even to get a general house ruling or a good understanding on how mind effects like that should be played in game and whether or not they should be used sparingly because of fun factor or if there are tweaks that should be made to make your games better. I do bring this up because a lot of your fear effects will completely take your character either out of the game entirely or for a good portion of the combat sequences, or even possibly even in role playing in general, because of how the effects work. So it affects both the player and the DM or GM, because players can also do mind effects on NPCs and therefore causing the GM to have to also juggle some of this stuff. And then who manages the character or NPC while they're in mind control mode is another thing that should be discussed, because I've heard some players say that they would rather fail a save or even have their character die than run around in fear and not be able to actually do anything in combat or general role play. And that's a powerful thing to hear from a player, because the whole point of having people sitting at your table is to have them playing the game with you. And if they're not getting to play, then you're pretty much just hanging out with friends while you're playing with your own NPCs. So some things to consider, like fear, for example. Just being fear or having your character under the fear effects for just 3 rounds. Say you're in a party of 6 players in the game, and if all your players act quickly because they want to be efficient and get as much gaming in as possible and keep things moving along so people aren't getting bored or exhausted, then your player, the player that can't act because they're under the fear effect, don't get to play for almost 20 minutes. And that's just for 3 rounds of combat or 3 rounds of interaction of something. And it gets worse, because if you're going up against a creature like a vampire who's only a CR9 creature, which I know is saying only CR9, but when you got creatures in the game that are much more powerful and your levels go up so high, CR9 isn't considered like the end of a campaign level normally. So if you have a vampire, they can cast Dominate Person at will. There's no cooldown needed, nothing. They just basically say, all right, next I'm going to try and dominate you. And then bam, they can just do that. No limit to the amount of times they can do it, other than the amount of actions per turn per the rules. But they don't run out of that through like an encounter or through a day or what have you. They just keep doing it in person. So the DC to save on, it's usually pretty high. It's in the mid-20s, unless there's modifiers and everything else thrown in there. But a vampire can very easily dominate an entire group, and then not only are you fighting the vampire, you're fighting your teammates, or maybe not fighting at all because he took everybody over and then just kills you all. So it's not very much fun when even just 3 rounds of combat means sitting out 20 minutes of your night of gaming. That's just kind of bringing some numbers to the table for you to consider. So if you're a GM DM, keep it in mind. Even though fear effects and and domination and mind altering and all this stuff is all part of the game, and it can bring some really cool, interesting twists to the game. It can also really, really destroy a campaign. And all it takes is one bad gaming session to end your campaign early. So discuss with your players in advance how you want to handle fear effects and domination and such. And the reason I bring that up is because you have the question of, should the player control their own character when they're being mind controlled, or should they just be NPC'd at that point and just sit out of the game? Um, some DMs will say, here, I don't want to juggle your character. Just roleplay the best you can. Just remember, your character is running away the best that he can to get away because he's afraid. He's not just going to hang out and just watch the battle if there is an exit. He may have to exert, or she, I keep saying he or she may have to exert some of their magical items or powers or spells or whatever in order to expedite the retreat of sorts. They may even teleport completely away from the encounter, leaving all their friends behind and not returning at all. It is a possibility. And the question then comes down to the player, do I do the bare minimum role playing of trying to run away in hopes that I overcome this effect or someone gets me out of it in time to help save the day? Or do I go to the extreme and actually take every single maximized possibility I have at my disposal to get away because I'm in fear? And then if they have to exert some of their own resources, say they have scrolls, potions, magic items like a wand that doesn't refresh those charges or what have you, do you require your players to use up as much of that as they can? And in the process, do you reward them in a way that compensates them when the encounter is over? Because the encounter is only worth so many gold pieces worth of magic items or value, basically. And you don't want to just basically give people infinite uses of their gear. But at the same time, you don't want to screw your party and have people not actually be able to utilize the rewards that they should have been given up to that point. So it's a lot to kind of juggle and decide, and finding a balance all comes down to the group. And you hear this all the time. It all comes down to your gaming group and seeing what works best for them. And it's true, because some people don't mind a more realistic, that's the Hard Knocks Life gaming style. Some people just can't handle losing all their gear and starting fresh, or they aren't imaginative enough to take on other items and try to accomplish the same thing, or what have you. Some dungeon masters or game masters love just throwing a bunch of items onto their players, or giving them pretty much anything they ask for. And then other GMs are very tight on the items that they dole out. They may be tight on doling out because they are aware of how broken some items can get, or they may be tight because their campaign doesn't support having tons of magic items just available at your disposal. Doesn't matter, it's a whole different discussion. But when it comes to spells, effects, so on and so forth, that completely take your character out of the game and has some kind of monetary consequence in game for that, or what have you, the group really needs to have an understanding of how that's going to work. I've been in campaigns where the combat monster would be the guy carrying all the gear that we planned on selling in town at some point. Well, if he gets mind controlled, there goes the entire party's gear because they didn't have the strength to lug it around, or what have you. He may end up dropping all of that stuff trying to get away because he needs to go quicker. Or, I mean, realistically, would somebody in fear of their life really want to carry, different sets of armor and weapons and random gear that needs to be sold with them, when in a realistic viewpoint they would try to lighten their load as much as possible and just run. Would they drop their weapon, or would they see that as a, no, I'm going to need that to get away from the next monster? It's hard to role play it and justify it and not really screw over the party. But at the same time, everyone should have a good understanding of what being in fear means, or being shooken means, or if you're being mind controlled, does your character know that he's being mind controlled or she's being mind controlled and just doesn't have control over their body? Or are they completely unaware what's going on and they truly believe what the mind control is telling them? It's one of those things that you as a group needs to decide that, so that one moment someone being afraid and is under a fear effect isn't running away, and the next one they're just kind of casually walking, avoiding the combat. It makes a huge difference in dynamics and consistency. Not everybody cares about consistency. Sometimes they're just worried about whether the night was fun and everything went well or smoothly, and that's the end of it. They don't care if tonight fear makes you run away and the next night fear just makes you stay out of combat. It all comes down to your preferences. But these are things that really need to be discussed and be gone over with a fine-tooth comb, because it really does ruin the game for players, more so than DMs and GMs, in my opinion, because a GM's not necessarily losing their character. They're not necessarily having their character look like they've just been pwned by someone who clearly normally wouldn't be able to do so just because they had a bad roll. Also, everyone imagines their characters being these really big heroes and going around doing these great deeds. If your character can go toe to toe with a dragon, that's gargantuan sized, but the next day he's afraid of a low level vampire, it doesn't really feel the same, and it really throws it off, and it takes away quite a bit sometimes. So you really need to discuss all of that with your players and with your GM. If your GM's using it a lot, bring it up. It may be something that is taken away and people don't want to go through. I've actually, like I said, I've heard people say they'd rather just have their character die than not be able to play at all. I've seen people completely give up on characters because of what happened while they were under fear effects, made their character less cool, and so they no longer wanted to play them because they didn't want the embarrassment throughout the entire campaign, or other characters trying to ride them on, remember that time that you had, stuck your head in that hole of fire ants or something, and they ate, 1 point of charisma off your face or something. It's, no one cares, but there are some people who take their characters a little too serious, and when you get into mind control stuff, it really makes a big difference. Plus, like if you mind control a wizard, you got fireballs and stuff you got to worry about. Maybe even curses come out after that, or maybe the curse is what made you have the mind affecting thing to begin with, such as you can be cursed and have a 50% chance of not doing any action. That is a little better to role play. I've heard people say they'd rather have that kind of a curse than actually have a fear effect, mainly because it's less affecting on the character's perceived personality or perceived ability than someone just running away in fear. So I wanted to bring up this topic because it's very important. None of my groups that I've ever gamed with has ever really talked about it. They've at some point brought up how they want you to play the character, because at one time my GM didn't want to have to micromanage your character on top of all the other monsters and NPCs and stuff that were being controlled by him. So he'd rather you still be able to play in the game a little bit, even if it wasn't the way you wanted to play. But it's something that you really need to discuss, because if your character ends up dying while not even under your control, it feels even worse because you didn't get another save, or you didn't try to kill the monster. You just basically ran away and got fireballed or something. So, got any input you want to put in there? I do understand different ways of rolling with it as a DM. I do understand changing up some of the encounters, especially if the players are using those abilities quite a bit and taken away from the game. But if you got suggestions on how your group has done it, or how you would like to see groups do it, maybe you've got an experience you just want to share with it, drop those in the comments section down below. I'd be happy to read through it and discuss it with you. But that's pretty much the end of this discussion for now. If you also have any other suggestions on topics you'd like me to go over, feel free to drop those in the comments too. I'd be more than happy to discuss them. But until next time, have a good one.